I wish conservatives would give a little more thought to saying things like, we need to take our country back, and if Kennedy were alive today, he'd be a Republican. Republicans talk about how the party switch was bogus, which is true. The party switch was bogus, but then they'll turn around and say that Kennedy would be a Republican today. Sorry to tell you this, but that's a little contradicting.
I think what's happening. Propaganda.
We talk about how good it was back in the day. Can I remind y'all of something? Back in the day sucked too. Back in the day, people were talking about the good old days. Well, what were the good old days? Segregation, the misery index, the Great Depression, the Cold War? What when? What are these good old days that you want to take the country back to? For some people, sure, it was better yesterday than it is today. But for the most part, when people want to talk about the good old days with people, those same people were miserable back in those days too. The problem is people take their present times for granted. Now don't give me some noise about that's not true, Zoe, because when Reagan was president, things were really good. Really? Well, if they were that good, how did you let a good thing go? If Reagan established such a good policy of prosperity, how did we let that get lost? If Reagan laid down something so awesome, then we should have exercised that same kind of awesome to protect and maintain what that God-fearing man represented. But now all conservatives do is lament over how great Reagan was, saying things like, I wish Reagan would come back. Who's gonna be the next Reagan? If you wanted to follow any example of Reagan, Reagan would tell you that your expectations for anyone to come back would be better invested in Jesus, because he's the only one who actually can come back. But in the meantime, Jesus left us some really good instructions. And instead of that time spent wishing for the next Reagan, maybe it would go well to read the instructions that worked for him. They were good enough for Reagan. Why aren't they good enough for you? Reagan would ask you, why are you looking for someone to be Reagan-like? I was trying to follow the Lord. So one, if you're going to say we need to take this country back, you really need to find what that is that you're talking about taking this country back to. And two, if you're going to take the country back to this awesome place, I hope that you have a better plan to keep it. As Franklin said, we've given you a republic. If you can keep it. We're kind of losing it, ain't we? People who say we need to take this country back is like an empty statement. It's like a person who argues that the Confederate flag represents heritage, not hate. The heritage of this flag is hate. It represents history. Yeah, a history of hate. But while we're at it, let me tell you why saying this flag represents history or heritage is an empty statement. If this flag represents heritage or history, is that what it represented when it was woven for the Confederacy? Hey, they just sewed our flag together, guys. Awesome. What does it stand for? Well, I don't know. It's only about an hour old. It stands for heritage and history. So you mean to tell me that that's what this flag has always stood for? Heritage and history? That doesn't even make any sense. I've always stood for heritage and history before I even had one. No, what it stood for was hate and the so-called freedom to have a market to oppress others. But it doesn't surprise me that people would be in denial over that flag. The very nature of that flag is denial, like denying people of their God-given rights. I would offer, if you're going to say we need to take our country back, I would say take the country back to what was outlined in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while maintaining the balance of freedom so that people don't assume to enjoy their ideals while infringing upon the rights of others. Now to this business about conservatives saying that Kennedy would have been a Republican. Can y'all stop saying that? Kennedy was a philandering opportunist who supported Jim Crow laws. He opposed civil rights. But when he and LBJ saw that they could make a voter stock out of the black community for the Democrat Party, they jumped on it. That's why LBJ said, I'll have those N-words voted for the Democrat Party for the next 200 years. It is of no compliment to the Republican Party to suggest that Kennedy would be a Republican. Why? Because he hated communism? So what? Hitler hated communism too. But his worldview ultimately leads to communism, just as the Democrat platform ultimately leads to communism. It always has. Just because Democrat administrations went to war with the socialists and communists doesn't mean that they themselves aren't. What happened after World War II? Right after the troops were coming home for being at war with these factions, the policies of socialism were being instituted here, and they voted in favor of the very things they were just at war against. So just because a Democrat claims to hate socialism or communism doesn't mean they would be a Republican today. A Democrat is going to be a Democrat. And among the characteristics of a Democrat is to be contradicting and confused. I'm Alfonso Rachel with Zone Nation and conservatives. It's not a good selling point to suggest that Kennedy would have been a conservative or a Republican. It's really counterproductive. We're telling people that they don't need to depend on the Democrats to save them, yet you're relying on a Democrat to save your image. Back in the day sucked too.